noted election manager, James Carville, used to have a sign on his wall saying, "It's the economy, stupid," which was a kind of slightly derogatory reference to Mr. Clinton when he was getting into his high-flown rhetoric about reshaping America and all the rest of it. He's got to understand that at the end of the day, as the Americans call it, pocketbook issues, it's all about money. And I think that's very much what these issues concern. And I think there is an intersection in Nigeria between the world of the economy and the world of politics, and it's absolutely wedded. And on one hand, as Dapo has said, you get the bold reformers like our good friend Kaudi Fayemi, who I went to visit him a couple of times in Ekiti State, and he was clearly running a very good government. He was really trying to get public goods out there, particularly in the health and education sector. The commissioners he had in those areas were absolutely brilliant young people. They were committed, highly qualified, and serious. And it wasn't, so it's really easy to say that about a friend, but it wasn't stage managed, I can tell you. And I was just dumped in an office with a bunch of young people, and they were running around, and it wasn't a play. They were really serious about, these computers are coming in, how are we going to get them to the right people, and all the rest of it. And I think actually, I found, personally speaking, what was going on in Ekiti a bit more impressive than what's going on in Lagos, simply because, as Paul points out, Lagos has got far more money, and the trade-off that Dapo was talking about between the taxpayers, so-called the people that produce the tax revenue, however Tinubu and then Fashola raised it. These were the sort of super elite, and most of the money, let's face it, in Lagos is not spent in Ajagunle or my old domain of Mushin. It's actually spent in Victoria Island, Lekki, Ikoyi, of course, and this appalling in my view, I'm airing my public prejudices or private prejudices publicly. This is called Echo Atlantic City, which is built on the sea at huge cost, and I guess it has all the making of a vanity project, actually financed by a man who was charged by the Swiss authorities, Gilbert Shagari, as Abacha's finance advisor, and he's charged by the Swiss authorities of being involved in a criminal organization, laundering money he stole from Nigeria. He was charged by the Swiss authorities in 2000, but somehow he's managed to, he handed 500 million of the money he stole back to the former National Security Advisor, Aliou Gusau, and that then gave him a free pass to come back to Nigeria and continue in business in Nigeria in very much the same sort of ways was operating in the past. So I think that's a bit of a warning about what's going on, the money that's sluicing through both state and federal government. So I'd say, and to me, that's a great example of the informal power structures that have been touched on, the patron-client network, and, who puts these state governors into power? The political godfathers, of course, and who do they represent? How do they get their funding? And these are the sorts of problems. And I think the example again of Ekiti State really gave you an insight into how these pressures work. Here you had a guy like Kaudi who was reforming the system, trying to, against some political advice, he was taking on the local civil servants. And he's saying, look, if you're civil servants, you can't operate taxi services and catering services from your office. When you come to the office in the morning, you've got to do a job, and we've got to get the government running. If you want to run a taxi service, go and run it, and someone else will take it. And that, sad to say, that made him extremely unpopular, and also looking at contracts, looking at all the ways that these governments do their procurement and checking on that. He tried to cut into that, and again fell foul of a lot of vested interests in the state. So what did those people do? They got together. with the PDP, the federal government, and they put up a candidate who was Mr. Populist, and he drove around the state in his big car. He would stop at a roadside restaurant and say, "Oh, what are you eating? Oh, Eber and beans. I'll join you." And he would sit there, eat with the people, and then at the end of the meal, he would dash the woman who'd cooked the food loads of money, and everyone sitting around would get loads of money, and that was a stomach infrastructure. Simply, if you like, advance fee fraud. He would actually pay the money up front to the people he wanted to influence, and then get into power, and then start stealing. And that's that's the tragic thing. And there's a tragic thing with the particularly the structures of state government at the moment, that there's considerably less accountability in state government than there is in federal. And we all know that there are pretty strict limits on the amount of accountability in federal government. But there is an auditor. There's an Auditor General's report, and these reports are getting better and better. We're a year into the Buhari's government, but we've had some pretty serious audits from the NNPC for the first time in many years. We're getting audits from other areas of government. Not pretending that he's cracked it in a year, but we're seeing some progress. But we're seeing very, very little progress on the state government front. You talked, I think there was a story about the latest bailouts, or maybe half bailouts, i.e. that the government is going to give the state government some sort of respite on the debt servicing. The question is, why are they borrowing, and what is this money being used for? No one's too clear. But certainly last year, as Paul pointed out in the paper, there was a great opportunity for Buhari to really get tough with these guys and say, okay, we understand you're broke. We understand that all the 36 state governments, bar maybe Lagos, Rivers, and Kano, are really struggling to survive. Let's do a deal. We have auditors in all your governments, and we get reports at federal level, and we work out what's going on with the money and why you've got these debts and what these debts are being spent on. I don't know whether it was because Buhari had his mind on other things, he hadn't appointed the ministers at that stage and all the rest of it, but it seems to me that there was a great opportunity that was lost to really read the Riot Act to this bunch of governors. I mean, part of the problem, again, is the partisanship issue. It's interesting, you were talking about the Governors' Forum. I mean, the Governors' Forum was actually the seat of the last political revolution in Nigeria, because, after all, it was Rotimi Amechi's leadership of that forum that sent the former president into apoplexy, and to such an extent he's kind of lost a sense of tactics, and it was his sort of personal rivalry with Amechi that ended up with him losing not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, 6 state governors, and they crossed from the ruling PDP with all that patronage. That was when the oil price was $80 a barrel. They crossed over to, they left and they crossed over to this new entity, or the new PDP. Originally, then it was the APC. And then, as we all know, the rest is history. Amechi is now transport minister, and Jonathan is facing an investigation. So it tells us something about the power of this organization. But again, it doesn't tell us much about how these the performance of the governors themselves, because so much of it is about the kind of political rivalries and I think the only way you're going to see reform is paradoxically a heavier hand from the centre. I mean, if they're going to get money, because at least this time the president was elected, and I don't think many people are going to quarrel with that election, how it happened. And so it's got a responsibility to look after the money, and I think it may be that is Buhari's game in the longer term. I mean, because he's up against, the critical issue he's up against is dealing with these patronage networks, and the patronage networks, of course, are national and state level too. But if he comes down and he starts to get more accountability at state level, I think that's going to be all to the good. And there's a political logic that should operate. That if governors were providing better services, particularly health and education, to the people in the states, they should become more popular. That's the sort of theory, and the theory is that all this taxation, because that everyone says that's going to be the big push now, to raise all sorts of local government, local revenues through sales taxes and various other devices, VAT and so on. It's going to be very interesting to see just how far that's actually connected to some sort of political accountability. The record so far hasn't been great. Lagos raises the most revenue, but as you're saying in your report, the majority of people in Lagos, that is the 90% of people in Lagos State who don't live on Victoria Island and Ikoyi, they're not getting much out of the system. And all the tracking. So we certainly need much more auditing of what's happening. So I'd argue, as well as the push on internal revenue, there should also be a push on auditing what's done with the revenue that is raised. I should be part of that. It's good to see that the budget group and all the rest of it are getting onto it. So just the final thing I'd say, it will come out in questions, but a lot of people don't like the state system. There are some people, perhaps the sort of older generation, want to go back to some sort of regions, 3, 4, whatever. And if you look at other parts of the world, first with the continent of Africa, Kenya has just introduced a couple of years ago the county system, which is just wrecking their budgets, because with each of the 47 counties in the country, you get these sort of local political systems built up, and that whole sort of network of staffing, cars, and all the rest of it. South Africa had that choice in '94, and a lot of people, particularly Buthelezi then, was pushing for a very federalized system. They didn't want a unitary government and all the rest of it. And the ANC, I think, for the ANC's sake anyway, wisely resisted that, and the country held together better. But I think you're now seeing those sorts of pressures again, and with the provinces getting more and more power. So I think essentially the arguments that have been raised by this crisis, I do think there is certainly a financial crisis in the states. That's beyond doubt. Whether there's also a political crisis, we're going to see. But I do think when you've got this sort of block in the Delta and the Southeast that is politically oppositional to the federal government, that's going to raise a real question of how those people think their interests are going to be served. What are they going to wait until there's a crisis, maybe over the president of the Senate, and then there's a big split in the APC ranks in the National Assembly, and that, like the split in 2011, could be reflected in a wider split, and some APC states then turn PDP states, and they build up that way. I think that there are certainly difficult times in the States could actually prompt some kind of political ruction. So I think that would be important to see. So I think from the federal government's position, they've got to find ways, I think, to really audit that money and try and get better value for money, whatever happens. Because at the end of the day, it's, the state governors are in this weird position. They're incredibly powerful, but they can always blame the center for what's going wrong, and you can say, well, there I was just minding my own business, and good luck Jonathan did X, Y, Z, and that's why the place is in a mess. And I think that's a real lesson for the Buhari government. They've got to work out. They're already getting the blame for this economic situation. Maybe due to the price of oil. It's due to a lot of other things too. But if the states are not running well, it's going to reflect on them as much as the governors.